Salutations and welcome to GlitchBottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alexander Eth, and today on the podcast we are so excited to welcome intellectual historian, philosopher, and hermetic delver, Mr. Dan Atrell. Dan Atrell is a Canadian-born intellectual historian, a classicist, a philosopher, a psychonaut, and a musician. Dan is also known online under the moniker The Modern Hermeticist, and he has a blog, a YouTube channel, and a Twitter presence under the same name. In this podcast, we speak with Dan about anything and everything related to Hermeticism, its history, its philosophical tenets, and its actual manifestations in the modern world. We also talk about the influence Hermeticism has on esoteric practices and magic, the importance of fitness and physical health in a Hermetic context, and we even touch on the American philosopher, dreamweaver, and psychonaut Terrence McKenna as well, and much more. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, I give you Mr. Dan Atrell. Dan Atrell, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks, Alex. It's nice to be here.
Well, it's a pleasure, absolutely. You are known online as the Modern Hermeticist, and you have a website, you have a Twitter account, you have a YouTube channel, and I want to get into all that, but can we just start a little bit with your background, your educational history? Can you share a little bit about how you got interested in this sealed subject known as Hermeticism?
Sure. I came to Hermeticism rather obliquely. I came to it probably first. My interest in the ancient world was propelled by having been raised within a traditionally religious Protestant household. And so I was raised from a very early age with scripture, with Bible, with things like spiritual principles and spiritual warfare and that kind of stuff. So all of these things kind of propelled my interest into the occult, into hidden things. History was kind of coupled with that because, you know, you're reading the Bible, so you're reading about ancient Hebrews and Romans and Greeks and stuff like that. And so that's all a mess in your head when you're young. You can't really distinguish what's what and who's doing who and what's going on kind of in the greater scheme of things. There's just kind of a blur that is the ancient world where everything runs contiguously, and there's no distinction or boundaries or markers to help you figure out what you're actually looking at. So that propelled me into history and kind of sorting out the whole mess. What worked for me was studying religious history or intellectual history, so politics and culture and all these kinds of things. But I am, but not as much, interested in material culture. So archaeology, I've done some digging in Romania, and I like it, and it was kind of like a service to the discipline kind of thing. But it's not really my cup of tea. I'm more interested in kind of the idea sphere. Mm-hmm. And so that's what propelled me toward Hermeticism, which is, depending on whether you want to think of it in the modern term or in the ancient term, either way, it's a synthesis of ideas, often conflicting or contradictory ideas that are allowed to stand as a sort of coincidence of opposites. And so that school of thought of kind of, okay, what do these people think? What do Buddhists think? What do Catholics think? What do voodoo priests think? I don't know. Just grab it all, bring it all together, and let's look at this kind of with a feigned objectivity, because I don't really believe objectivity is possible. Right. I mean, I think there is an objective world, but it's outside of us. I think that is how I came to Hermeticism, was by a kind of, I guess, a mainstream approach. And then I got into it through studying mystery cults. And mystery cults kind of, you start reading the literature from that in the ancient world, and eventually you can't help but get to the Corpus Hermeticum and the Hermetic texts. So you start looking into that stuff, and then you start reading about the Renaissance Hermeticists and then the Hermeticists of the Victorian age, of the occult Renaissance in the Victorian era. And you start getting into Manly P. Hall and this kind of stuff. So there's a huge, rich tradition that can be followed. And it's, to me, what was important was to examine the tradition historically, like apply historicism, to look at things within their context. Because a lot of people who look into Hermeticism, they read the Kabbalion, or they read some sort of stuff that was written in the 19th century or the 20th century even, and they retroproject that. They send it back in time and they say, okay, this is what, like, the Egyptians believed. And I'm like, well, no, this is someone's, modern adaptation or adaptation of what he perceived in the ancient texts. But this isn't the ancient texts themselves, not even close. Right. So for me, it was important to disentangle all that stuff, to look at all of it set apart and kind of divided. And so that was my approach to it.
Well, that is very fascinating. And for the listeners who don't know, we'll put a link in the video description. But as of the recording of this interview, you have put up of the giant project that you started called the Encyclopedia Hermetica, A Big History, 44 parts so far. So for at least 44 hours, each video can be about an hour-ish, you have gone into this huge history on Hermeticism, and I definitely want to talk about that. But first, really briefly, for the listeners out there, especially if they're in the esoteric community, or if they study, Hermeticism, or if they consider themselves a Renaissancean Hermetic magician, if they go back to these texts in Europe and before, can you give us kind of your definition of Hermeticism? Dan Atrell's definition of what, if you were to boil this down to a few key words or key concepts, which I know is an incredibly loaded question and very hard to do, obviously, considering you're on the 44th video of the Encyclopedia Hermetica. But if you were to say, for instance, Christianity, there's a savior aspect, there's a redemptive aspect, there's an original sin aspect. Judaism is this, that, and the other. For the actual ideas embodied in the Hermetic tradition, what is your base definition for our listeners of Hermeticism, so to speak?
I think if I had to distill it all down into one kind of very, very, very stripped down interpretation, I would look at the world as the one and the many. That's really what kind of Hermeticism really means, is that the world never settles. It is always in an endless oscillation between the one and the many, between objectivity and subjectivity, between left-wing thinking or right-wing thinking, between hot and cold, between these opposites are constantly dancing and producing the world, or the phenomena that we perceive as the world. And Hermeticism is disentangling that without forcing it to a close. And I would say that applies to ancient Hermeticism as much as it applies to kind of 19th century Reconstruction Hermeticism, the Kabbalion type stuff. Truly ancient Hermeticism, or at least in its earliest form, what that was all about was syncretizing Egyptian and Greek thinking. Now, I don't want to overstress this idea that Egyptians are irrational or maybe irrational, whereas Greeks are logical. That's too strong of a kind of dichotomy. But they definitely had two divergent intellectual traditions, and they perceived the world in a very different way. And so you have this kind of rich intellectual climate in Alexandria, which has Jews and Egyptians and Greeks and Arabs and Indians and all sorts of other people, and they're all bringing their ideas together, their holy texts, and these become reconciled in some sense in the Corpus Hermeticum. And so that's really my interest with that whole lecture series, is disentangling all these different threads that make up Hermeticism.
It's so easy for people to get lost in, certainly when I first started reading it, I was like, ooh, the Kabbalion, and, I'm getting into all this early 20th century stuff, thinking that it had roots that were, thousands of years old, and not realizing, or, you look at the Golden Dawn and their Hermetic aspects, and you're like, yeah, this is all 100%, has its roots in some aspect of history, and then you realize, as you just said, that no, there's certainly roots there, but there's a lot of reading back into that. When you read the Corpus Hermeticum, you're just blown away by the fact that there is nothing but, as one translation says, just the experience, almost the visionary experience of this sweet, joyous light, this all-encompassing man-Shepernian mind that just literally just takes you to a new elevated state of consciousness.
Right. I mean, it's the one lurking behind many phenomena, all the smoke and the lights and the shifting and this kind of dragon figure that's in the Poimandres. It's the one and the many.
Yes. Or to quote Terrence McKenna, it's a multidimensional psychedelic object at the end of time that's slowly pulling us towards it in some weird, multidimensional consciousness-raising elevation, which is certainly an interesting way to experience it, for sure.
Right. Or destroying.
Or destroy. Yes.
That's the other thing, is that, Terrence McKenna, he likes to really put a spin on it, that it is this positive kind of transcendental, hopeful thing, and that's a good thing. Well, it's like, I call that monist death math, and it is the denial of life, of the many. It is the worship of death, of singularity, of the one. And so, it is transcendent, and it is sublime, and it is necessary as part of this kind of constant dance between the one and the many. But it is ultimately the extinction of all difference, which means the extinction of all life, because life is difference.
I remember, to that point, I remember Terrence McKenna mentioned that, as soon as someone discovered how to invent a time machine, effectively history is over at that point, because once you can close the circular loop back, to any point in time, it effectively ends historical context, which
right.
goes to your point about, it's then time for humanity in either as you mentioned, a death of sorts, or a transformation of sorts, to completely reevaluate itself. And I always wonder if you and I will be around for that, You always wonder, time-wise.
We all will ultimately experience our own individual transcendental objects at the end of time. So, the apocalypse is for everyone. It doesn't really matter if it happens kind of on the objective stage, because it's going to happen to everybody on the subjective stage.
I love that quote, the apocalypse is for everyone. I might have to tweet that later and attribute it to you, Dan. Well, to continue with the small mouth noises, as Terrence McKenna would say, why don't we talk about history a little bit? Because your Encyclopedia Hermetica, A Big History, is on its 44th part now. And we'll make sure to put a link to the videos and your channel in the description of this video. But can you tell us what was the main genesis behind starting an entire series? Did you feel that Hermetic history and literature at that point was missing a few things that you wanted to touch on, or did you feel that you wanted to look at the history and share your own personal view of it? Was it kind of a mix between the two? What started this whole thing?
I mean, there were kind of a number of reasons why I started. One of them was that I had seen that in kind of the world, in the public sphere, not so much in the academic sphere, but places like YouTube and that sort of thing, when it comes to the occult, or when it comes to even just history, things are either ADD-ified, made kind of bite-sized and kind of trivialized in a way, or they're just flat out crazy. Like there's just so much insanity in the occult, because it is the kind of thing that attracts and appeals to a wide range of people, and it kind of facilitates or gives legitimacy to some kind of crackpot kind of thinking, everything from flat earth to time cube. It's like there's just an endless ocean of people who want to believe anything and get really dogmatic about it too. So that was, I don't want to say it's alarming to me, but I was like, okay, well, if I get a complaint about it, then I better do my part and do what I think is setting the record straight, or at least give my perspective on things. And so the problem is, when you are in academia, nobody cares what your opinion is, right? And so it doesn't matter what you want to say. You have to say what someone else has already said, or back it up with evidence and facts, which is totally a good and excellent thing, and that's admirable. It doesn't allow you to kind of rap freely about these subjects, and people get lost in that. Nobody wants to read these kind of like dry, long treatises on anything, really. They want it to be digestible or conversational. They want it to be in manageable chunks and organized, not just kind of, here's a bibliography, go. Because nobody's going to do that. So my thoughts were, nobody these days reads anymore, so I'm going to read to them.
Right.
And that was it. And that's why I call them lectures in the kind of classic sense of lecture, readings, because that's kind of how the series started. I would just kind of grab a book and I would work through it, and I would kind of flip through some pages, and if there was something of import that jogged my memory, then I would say it. Over time, that evolved, because as time progressed, we get more and more sources, more and more evidence, more and more specialists with conflicting opinions, and so I had to start writing a script, because I couldn't just rap about this kind of stuff and do it any justice. I had to do research beforehand and take a couple days to write my stuff, otherwise the quality would be bad. So that was a big part of it. It was kind of giving my 2 cents, which is, in my opinion, a sober perspective, but not one that is, I suppose, stifled in the imagination. And so it's something that I have the liberty of doing when I'm outside of academia, and so I'm having a lot of fun with it. But it's also not the only mode of doing things. There's also writing books and hitting up the archives and doing all the translation work and that sort of thing. And that's kind of what's behind the scenes, because you don't really put much of that stuff out on YouTube, because nobody really cares.
I certainly agree with you that the trend in at least 2017 and the last few years has been a blessing, of course, because you're more connected technologically than you ever had before, but then at the opposite end of that is you also get all the distraction and all of the minutia and all of the advertising and all of the consciousness degrading things that usually tend to interfere with absorbing quality information, such as your video series. So I certainly will encourage listeners to check it out, and we'll put a link to the series and to your channel as well. And this kind of touches on something, Dan, another aspect of your being the quote-unquote modern hermeticist, and that is an emphasis on, of course, as you say on your website, expanding the mind, kind of ingraining hermetic principles and living by those principles. And one of those things that you mention online is the topic of fitness and on just taking care of yourself regarding overall health, fitness, researching, nutrition, all that stuff. Can you talk about, if someone wants to be a hermeticist or wants to engage in hermeticism, what is the hermetic approach to fitness and to incorporating the physical aspect of this kind of overall consciousness expanding philosophy into your life? What are some of the fitness things that the modern hermeticist is into?
What I would do is I would divide this up into two kind of things. There's health on one hand, and then there's fitness on another hand. And then those are kind of two separate but not necessarily distinct domains. On the fitness side of things, there's no one size fits all, obviously. I mean, everybody has their own sport or activity that they like to do. As long as it gets you panting and soaked in sweat and sore the next day, then that's probably good enough. For me personally, I like Olympic-style weightlifting, and I like powerlifting, and I like yoga. And those are really the three things, I guess two things, that I really enjoy. And that's because it is the pursuit of perfecting form. And it is also a way of distilling mind or will, or basically just hard work, into tissue, into literally your body. It's this really amazing kind of alchemical process of transforming your body and becoming what you are, as the philosophers like to say. It's kind of carving out what is there at kind of the center of you, and finding that and then becoming it. And to me, there's something very spiritual about that, and that's because I'm a monist, essentially. I mean, I'm not strictly a monist, but by and large, monism is what I lean towards. I do not like to make this distinction between the mind and the body. I like to think of, all reality is divine, but it is ultimately physical, and that there are kind of worlds in between and dimensions and that can be achieved, but ultimately this is all one thing, and these are all operating simultaneously on various levels. In regards to fitness or whatever, if your body is fit, if your body-mind complex is in good health and it is fit, it is capable of doing tasks, it leads to a more rewarding, happier life. There's just no doubt about it. And I mean, I don't know what other people's goals in life are. Mine is to live a happy and healthy life, and that's about it. I don't really have great aspirations to transcendence toward godhood or something like that, or ultimate beatific union with the divine or whatever, because to me, we're already there. I don't support this Gnostic Manichaean duality that I was raised with, this kind of polarizing idea that there is a physical world that is somehow fallen and broken, and that there is an ideal spiritual world that is beyond, and that world is superior and has to be tapped into through asceticism. I don't personally subscribe to that. But since I look at things in a kind of monist context, all these things click together, and health fits into that part as well. The absence of pain is very important. I mean, how can you study or think about lofty things or do anything, have pleasure, raising a family or whatever it is you want to do, if you're constantly in pain? So
Great point.
That's something kind of that I've drawn from the Epicurean or Democritean schools of thinking, which is the antithetical way of thinking in the Western tradition. It's the way that was hidden. And that's something that I want to talk about a lot in my series, is that there are kind of these two competing schools of philosophy, if we want to distill it into broad strokes like that, and that is between the realists and the idealists, and that history is kind of born out of this dialectic between not the rich and the poor, not man and woman, but the idealist and the realist. And so that's something that interests me. So that's where training and physicality and all of this kind of stuff fits in. It's part of expanding consciousness, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. I mean, you are literally, when you do something like powerlifting or whatever, you are causing growth in your nervous system. You're causing like your nerves to become more intertwined with your body, and you can activate it in kind of more fascinating ways than you could otherwise. And if you don't use your body, it atrophies. The nerves like waste away. Your connection to your muscles, to your body, essentially kind of fades. And there are a lot of people who they see themselves as heads on bodies, not bodies or body heads, or this kind of complex of the two unified into one thing. They are infected with dualism. They're infected by Platonism, and so they allow themselves to kind of waste away or wither away, and they don't care about their body because they've adopted this doloristic, ascetic tradition rather than the tradition of, let's say, classical paganism, whether in Greek or Roman or Norse world or whatever, where physicality was it was important. It was something that was indistinguishable from life, because it was life.
I think for many people in the occult or esoteric community, a very common stage of realization that people go through. I can't speak for everyone, but I can certainly say for myself, what you touched on certainly resonates, because I remember growing up in a traditional Catholic environment and learning about original sin and this kind of good and evil dualistic concept, and then all of a sudden you start learning about Gnosticism, and you find out, the Yahweh in the Old Testament is actually a demiurge, a kind of mad, blind, William Blakean, angry, cold, tear-filled creator god. And above that, through the seven spheres, you'll find the plethora, the realm of Sophia, and true wisdom and understanding. And for a while, just like you, I was kind of immersed in that dualistic vision, but then in a switch that you just touched on, which I think also echoes certain elements of Buddhism and Taoism, there's this other breakthrough which you touch on, which is, forget about dualism. There is no lead that needs to be turned into gold. Everything already is gold. We just have to realize that we are gold and everything around us is gold. Would that be fair? Would that be what you're also touching on?
Absolutely. And I mean, that's how I came to it as well. And as cliche as it sounds, LSD and Buddhism is what brought me to that. It was kind of getting out of my cultural milieu, my medium, and going and looking at something completely different to kind of get a sense of, what is the source of all this confusion? Why do we need ontology? Why do we need epistemology? Why do we need all of these kind of various disciplines, subdisciplines in philosophy? They don't have this kind of stuff in Eastern philosophy. And then I went and looked, and I was like, oh, well, now I see why. And now you come back, and it's not that you come back to Western philosophy and you go, oh, Western philosophy is so silly, so filled with, naive assumptions and this and that. It's right. not. It's not that. It's just that you go, oh, I see there is a current of thinking in the Western tradition, which actually is quite analogous to quote unquote Eastern philosophy. And that you can actually go and find out that much of that stuff was not copied. It just didn't survive by and large because it didn't fit like Platonism or Aristotelianism fit with the dominant model, in the Middle Ages when people were copying all of these things. So Democritianism, books like Lucretius's De Rerum Natura, Epicurus's works, and none of which survive. None of these people have anything that survives. It's all mostly the works of Diogenes Laertius, which are very late, almost a millennium after these people actually lived. Well, maybe not that long, but you come back from studying Eastern philosophy and you look at the West and you see, this way of thinking actually did exist to some degree in the West. It was just it was the losing party, and it was written out of history. As a result of that, we inherit a lot of this intellectual baggage that comes down to us from the winning party. We say that we've divorced ourselves from religion or whatever, but even our secular humanism is largely based on religious principles. I mean, you think of, the U.S. Constitution or something like that.
Sure.
It is the Constitution, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident. Yes. That all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with unalienable rights. And it's like, where does all that stuff come from? Well, that's, none of that kind of stuff. You wouldn't find any of that in Eastern philosophy. This is an outgrowth of a kind of Platonic way of thinking, and that was the victorious way of thinking, thanks to Christianity's triumph over paganism.
And that brings us to one of the most interesting topics, and I know you've touched on this as well, Dan, is the relation between Hermeticism and effectively what's labeled as ceremonial magic or magical practices and esoteric practices. Can you just touch on what are your thoughts all the way back from the Greco-Egyptian papyri through to the Byzantine Empire, and then via Italy and the Latin Key of Solomon, and then distributing into London and the English-speaking part of Europe? There's been this transmission of grimoires and grimoiric texts where they propose a way for, and it was, as you know, very dangerous for people to even engage in this. If you were caught as a priest, for instance, with any of these books, you'd be executed summarily. From your perspective, from the Hermetic perspective, can you just touch on the importance of, or the role you saw or you see magic playing in terms of these grimoires that span over about 1,000 years? Because it seems that there were people who were willing to take considerable risk to consecrate circles on the ground, and even in a Terrence McKenna-like way, one could argue, raise their consciousness via a ceremony to interact with multidimensional beings. Can you just, what are your general thoughts, I guess, on magic in general?
All right. Well, the way to kind of frame this historically is that my approach to this, where I come from this, at least from a formal perspective, is having done a translation of the Picatrix, which is under peer review at the moment. I'm a co-translator and editor of this translation of this Arabic document, which contains, a massive compendium of spells. And what a lot of these spells are fundamentally pagan sacrifices to pagan gods. So now these are transmitted, and they are kind of framed within the context of astrology. So in the Picatrix, you get two major prayers which belong to the Sabaeans of Haran. And now these were a group of people living well, there are actually multiple groups called the Sabians or the Sabians. They're found in the Quran. They're one of the people of the book, so they're granted exemption. So then a lot of people started calling themselves Sabians in order to acquire the exemption from the Quran so that they didn't have to pay zakat or whatever it was. A lot of these kind of rituals, which were, say, the hymn to Saturn or the hymn to Jupiter, these were accompanied by astrological hours, the right times, the right clothing, the right instruments, the right objects, and these were all carefully delineated based on, sympathetic resonances with this deity, whichever respective deity was in question, and that went underground. That was transmitted to Europe through the Arabic world, generally into Spain. Spain was mostly the place that was receptive to these sorts of things, and they were translated from Arabic into Latin, and then they moved from there into the courts of Europe, or into what's called the clerical underbelly of the magical world, because grimoire magic requires literacy. And in an illiterate world, or in a world where only the clergy or the laity are literate, who's going to be reading these grimoires? It's usually going to be monks and priests.
Right.
So you have these people who are reading about a system of sacrifice, of conjuration, of prayer to pagan gods, but they are couched in kind of quasi-scientific terms. They're astrologized or whatever, and this gets interpreted by, say, Christians as ceremonial magic of summoning demons. So it's like you're not communing with the spirit of Saturn, you're communing with a demon. It can be no other way, because it's this kind of dualistic Manichaean system where there is just God, and then there are angels, and then those are divided into good and evil angels, basically. I mean, there are powers and principalities and all this and that, but by and large, from a very kind of simple rural Christian perspective, or Muslim perspective as well, this is kind of blasphemous material, because it's summoning ancient gods to attend your sacrifices, which is one of the most blasphemous things that you can do in a Judeo-Christian religious setting. I mean, that's the abomination of desolation in the Old Testament, or is a sacrifice to Zeus in the house of God, in the Temple of Solomon, and there can be no kind of higher blasphemy. That's the apex. And so magic is often conceived of as someone else's religion.
You touched on something certainly very important, that when you look at the Greco-Egyptian papyri, the magical papyri, that spanned anywhere from 300 years around the turn of the millennium, that the Egyptians were very neutral, so to speak, in their magical practice. They didn't view things as, bipolarly as Christian Europe, where it was, angels and demons, and it's either good or bad. They just kind of used whatever works. And I totally agree about Islam as well, where it is, of course, blasphemous. I think there might be a little more leeway, because at least with Islam you have the element or the dimension of the jinn. You have this kind of extra canonically accepted dimension of the jinn, where the word genie comes from, and so these beings of fire exist and they're accepted, but as you so eloquently touched on, it's very, very blasphemous. Just so interesting to see how the bipolar aspect towards magic changed once it hit Europe and the Middle Ages and all of that stuff, for sure. Dan, I know our time's winding down, but I have to ask you about Terrence McKenna, if we may. For the listeners who may not know, we'll put a few links in this video in the description to Terrence McKenna, but for those who don't know, his name's come up in our discussion a little bit, and both you and I are certainly fans and have watched a lot of his videos, and I've read a few of his books. I assume you have as well.
Yep. I think it's safe to say that I've listened to and read everything he's ever done. Now, of course, that isn't to say I agree with even like a quarter of it, but I've definitely listened to and could probably give a fairly good representation of his thoughts on a number of ideas.
I would absolutely have to agree. When you're on YouTube and you see literally a 10-hour lecture that's been compiled over like a weekend he did, you might say, oh, you'd be crazy to listen to that. I have probably listened to that video as you have, which is awesome to hear. And I know we could probably nerd out on Terrence McKenna. I was debating if we should turn Terrence McKenna into just a separate podcast if you have time in the future. But just for our listeners, briefly, can you talk about the influence of Terrence McKenna and its relation to Hermeticism? And for our listeners who don't know, Terrence McKenna effectively was one of the most influential American, effectively philosophers and psychonauts. He discussed philosophy, technological innovation, psychedelics, the impact on consciousness, time, the purpose of humanity, all that stuff. And there's thousands and thousands of hours, hundreds of hours certainly, of his lectures online. But one of the things that he talked about was the importance of psychedelics and the expansion of consciousness. And I'm just wondering, can you talk a little bit about the philosophy of Terrence McKenna regarding the expansion of consciousness via either psychedelics, or he also touches like in shamanistic cultures. You won't get the same thing as a DMT trip, but you can change your consciousness with rhythmic dancing and drumming and deep meditation, or even piercing yourself and lying in the hot sun and embracing pain. There's a myriad of ways to alter your consciousness and achieve some kind of higher state. But in your day-to-day workings as the modern hermeticist, what relation does Terrence McKenna's talks on consciousness expansion relate to, or what role does it play in Hermeticism as you see it and practice it?
So, Terrence McKenna's relationship with Hermeticism was a very strange one, because it was very colored by the literature that he had access to. And now I've heard, obviously, as probably most people have heard, that he had two kind of huge libraries where he collected all number of rare old Hermetic books. And both of those libraries have burned down, so we just have no idea what was inside of them. We can kind of reconstruct it based on the things that he's talked about, and I think there have been efforts to do that online. He really depended on the works of Carl Jung and the works of Mircea Eliade, and my thoughts on them are complicated because their understanding of Hermeticism and alchemy, which to them was kind of inseparable, and I think in the mind of Terrence McKenna it was also inseparable. And in my mind they are they overlap, but they are quite separable. Hermeticism is more of a kind of philosophical kind of current. Anything to do with the corpus hermeticum is Hermeticism, whereas alchemy is a whole other thing, because there is, iatrochemistry and there is chrysopia and there's all these different branches of alchemical pursuits, and some of them have a little bit of flirtation with Hermeticism and then others just don't at all. It's just kind of primitive chemistry. So what Jung wanted to do was look at alchemy as a mirror for the subconscious. And now that's dangerous, because that's not what obviously the people who wrote these books were trying to do. And so to interpret those grimoires, which are really like sacred, the code word compilations of deknomen, of words that mean chemical processes, these are occult notes. They're not meant to elucidate the scientific process. They're meant to hide the scientific process. And so in that way, they are hermetic in that they kind of lean towards occulting things. But I wouldn't say that there was so much of this, true alchemy was the projection of the unconscious in the alembic, and that the real alchemy happened inside the body of the alchemist and in his subconscious, and that the philosopher's stone was the psyche, and all. This is all modern projection on medieval alchemists who don't have this kind of rhetoric. And I give a talk called The Historiography on the Recent Literature of Alchemy, and I go into this in quite a lot of detail. So I think that Terrence McKenna was heavily informed by that sort of school of thinking about alchemy. Also, Dame Frances Yates, who created this sort of grand narrative of Hermeticism that spanned over kind of 1,000 years and went underground, and there's just not really much evidence for that. And so Terrence McKenna, as people have said before, never let facts get in the way of a good story, and that's really where he shines, is getting people interested in alchemy, getting people interested in Hermeticism and looking into this stuff, because it really is psychedelic. Let's be fair. Like, if you in the 90s, he was getting tired of talking about psychedelics all the time because he had been doing it for so long. So he wanted to shift gears and talk about something that was psychedelic but not laden with dogma, like, say, esoteric Tibetan Buddhism or Kabbalah or something like that, which he was familiar with these systems, but to him alchemy was the untouched system, and really only Carl Jung had tapped into this. I think it's interesting, and I like to read it, and I like to learn about what Carl Jung thinks about alchemy, to know about Carl Jung's unconscious, or to know about Terrence McKenna's unconscious. But what they had to say about the actual alchemists who lived throughout history is another matter entirely.
Well, we certainly will, if you're interested, absolutely have to discuss all of the good, the bad, and the just strange about Terrence McKenna in depth in a future time. But I certainly appreciate your time, Dan. Fascinating stuff. I encourage the listeners to check out the Encyclopedia Hermetica and your channel as well. And I guess as we wrap up here, Dan, is there anything else, any parting words of Sophia, Latin wisdom, or anything else that you might have, advice for those in the esoteric community, or anything about Hermeticism that you wish people in the esoteric community might keep in mind going forward?
Yes. And that is something that I've been trying to kind of get around as a meme or whatever, is that just is the dirtiest word in the English language, or merely, or only. So when you say, oh, that's just this, or that's merely that, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And so let's try to be cautious as to how we use the word just. We all do it. I do it too. And it can really get our minds stuck down one avenue or another rather than exploring both of them.
Well, that is certainly words of wisdom for all in the esoteric community, whether they are looking at grimoiric rituals or ceremonial magic, or exploring the history of Hermeticism, or popping on a Terrence McKenna lecture. Certainly boundary-dissolving advice from Dan Atrell. Dan, thank you so much for taking the time and joining us on the podcast today.
Well, thanks for having me, Alex. I really appreciate it.
And thank you for listening to this episode of the GlitchBottle podcast and helping us uncork the uncommon this fine day or night, or wherever you happen to occupy space-time in your occult lairs, your summoning towers, or your cloistered libraries of the esoterically awesome. You can check out previous episodes and other magical GlitchBottle news on YouTube, youtube.com/glitchbottle, and you can download episodes on our blog, glitchbottle.blogspot.com. Please make sure also to subscribe and follow us on YouTube, and also you can follow us on Twitter at GlitchBottle, all one word. Our intro music is the track Tornado by David Zeste. Our magical interest is fueled by sincerity, passion, amazing guests, and a copious amount of clinking coffee cups. Until next time, this is Alexander Eth reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.